logical argument, because it's after all your own mind that's at work, will come in rather than your imagination at work that needs to be sustained. So I have several sort of half-begun or even more than half-begun novels that I have abandoned on my laptops or my desktop, rather than actually books that ever saw the light of day. My last novel was 2001, Riot, and since then it's been nothing but non-fiction. I think one day it's quite possible that the voters will return me to the world of literature, and then I'll have a chance.
Then before you'll be back to writing fiction. Okay. So Shashi, you are unquestionably a major celebrity in this country and globally too, and a highly charismatic individual. You're also, of course, a politician. Could you reflect on the nexus in this country between celebrity and politics?
Actually, in all fairness, I think most politicians, and the country is full of very hard-working politicians, aren't celebrities. They don't get the sort of recognition they deserve, except in their own immediate circles, or their own constituencies, or their own areas, and so on. I mean, is that right? Would you all agree with me? I mean, many of you would not recognize your local MP, perhaps. And certainly there was a time when, not that long ago, when in fact the election posters didn't even carry the pictures of the candidate. But the fact is that now you are looking at an India which is more personalized in its politics, so individuals do get a chance to make their mark in China. I would argue, however, what's curious about this phenomenon is that ours, unlike the American system, is not supposed to be about individuals, it's supposed to be about parties. It's a parliamentary system. You're essentially supposed to be asking for votes, not for the person you are, but the kind of ideals, principles, and policies you represent and can implement if all the others like you in your party get elected. Now, I happen not to like that system. I much prefer a directly elected president, city mayor, chief minister, who will be accountable to the people as an individual, because I believe human beings are fundamentally individuals, and it's the individual we ought to judge. But that isn't the system we've got. We've got the parliamentary system. And in that situation, you could well argue there really is no room for celebrities. It's all about who sells the party agenda most plausibly.
So you've led a remarkably full and interesting life, and now we know that you don't have time to write fiction. So when are we going to get the full autobiography?
Michael, a few publishers have come knocking on my door, and I've always told them that, listen, I don't think I've accomplished enough to write an autobiography. I need to put a few more things under my belt before I feel it's worth writing. I admit there are interesting things about my life that are worth telling, and once in a while I regale people with anecdotes, but I don't actually write them up very much. And the big danger is, of course, that as you get too old, you might actually forget some of the more interesting things you've done. So at some point I will be tempted, but not yet.
And no chance, borrowing from something I heard Sanjay Roy say to you earlier, no chance of Shashi Tharoor slowing down, retiring?
No, I think what Sanjay very kindly was saying is don't attend too many other literary festivals. Come to Jaipur, but slow down elsewhere.
Slow down elsewhere.
No, the truth is that Jaipur was the first. I wrote a column in the Times of India, I think, or the Hindu, sometime in the first 5 or 6 years of the century, lamenting the fact that there were no literary festivals in India, and talking about the ones around the world that attended and what fun it is for the audience, for readers, for writers to get to know each other, to create a sort of community of writers. So I'd written about that. And then within about 3 years after that, JLF came into being. I missed the first one, but I came for the second JLF, and there were about 150 people sitting in chairs on this front lawn, and that was the best turnout they'd had. It really was a different era. But now, the country has witnessed a proliferation of literary festivals. Almost every second town has a literary festival, and the problem is most of them are in January. So I have been hurtling around a bit too much this month, and that's what Sanjay was referring to. But it's in some ways a good thing, because if literary festivals become a way of keeping books and reading alive in an era when there are so many other distractions, then I think something worthwhile is accomplished for them.
And going back to the earlier comment, which elicited a big audience response on your stand-up comedy, is there room still for humour in political life in India?
The short answer is no, which is why, when I did this stand-up comedy thing, a lot of my staff were extremely nervous. There's a thin line between being courageous and being foolhardy. And the big worry is whether I might trip over the line and fall on the wrong side. I think I got away with it. But generally speaking, my experience about humor in politics is in India it doesn't work. I mean, many of you are familiar with the big mishap I had in my first few months as a politician in this country when the government declared an austerity drive, and a journalist who turned out to be later a pro-BJP journalist wrote to me on Twitter saying, "So, Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel cattle class?" And I having come from 30 years odd abroad, where cattle class is a routine term, is not meant to insult anybody, is meant to insult the airlines for herding us all in like cattle. I replied, thinking that since he used the phrase and I knew the phrase and everyone knew it, I replied, "Yes, I'll travel in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows." But thank you, I'm glad somebody found it funny. The vast majority of India did not. I got on a plane and went off on an official visit to Africa. I was minister, the External Affairs Ministry at the time. And the dung hit the fan here. I mean, literally, it was front page news for 3 days, saying that I had demeaned and insulted economy class passengers. Every sort of socialist politician in my party stood up and demanded my head. The chief minister of this state asked for me to resign. I mean, the whole thing was just, and this, now, of course, I mean, you know, the whole thing got diffused when the prime minister, no less, told a gaggle of journalists, for God's sake, it was only a joke. And that somehow pricked the balloon, and that was the end of that. And for 3 or 4 days, it dominated coverage, and I realized the wisdom of Shakespeare's old line, going back, 400 plus, 500 years now, when he said that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. What a wise line that was. And I knew it and I should have remembered it, because essentially it is not what you intended to say and with whatever sincerity you said it, it's what people think they heard that matters. And that's so true in politics, because in politics, nothing matters but what people think. And what people think in this case is that I'm a jerk who compared all economy class travelers to cattle, which I did not and never intended to. But that was the example. And then the second problem in India, of course, is multilingualism. Cattle class may have been a familiar expression in English, and certainly in the West it was. But once you render it into Hindi and Malayalam and Bangla and Gujarati, boy, you're done. I mean, so after that, to this day, as you'll see, you've just go on my social media timelines, there'll be somebody flinging that at me day after day after day. They haven't understood what I was trying to do, but it wasn't, obviously, the price I paid for it wasn't worth the success of a joke.
Far too high. And also, the audience might not be aware that Shashi is putting together a book of, I think, your 200 most mellifluous phrases in the English language.
No, I'm not. What I'm doing is, the Hindustan Times talked me into doing a sort of word of the week, which was actually a light-hearted thing I thought I'd toss off, simply because in a curious sort of way, I never thought that there was anything particularly unusual. I mean, I learned my English in India, for God's sake. I went to English medium schools and colleges here. Half the words I use, I've been using as a debater since Stephen's College. I mean, the fact is, these were words that were not that bizarre or uncommon in those days, and we rather prided ourselves on mastering some quote-unquote obscure or difficult words, because in undergraduate life you want to sound clever, and sometimes the words stick in your head and sometimes they don't. But here it became a bit of a joke.
That's unquestionably one of your great calling cards, isn't it, too?
It's become sort of a brand thing now, which I had never expected it to be. So I thought, why not? Because it wouldn't be a bad idea to just talk about words in a more interesting way than a dictionary would. So, talk about anecdotes relating to the words, their context, they use, their origin, and so on. And that kind of caught on. I did wonder how long the thing would last, but we're heading up almost to a year's worth of columns, and meanwhile, a number of different publishers came up asking if I could make a book on words, and the first one to come was Penguin, who said, somebody had cracked a joke about whether I was writing a Tharurosaurus, which of course is meant to be a play on thesaurus, but also sounded like a terrifying dinosaur. So, and there I am, the terrifying dinosaur of Indian politics. But anyway, so I finally succumbed, and so we'll be putting a number of these words of the week along with suitable illustrations, light-hearted illustrations, into a volume sometime in the first half of this year.
Well, I'm sure we all look forward to that.
Well, it's the kind of book that people should keep in their bathroom and dip into once in a while, you know. Might be a good cure for you-know-what. But anyway.
Right, on that note, I'm going to throw the floor open to Q&A. So,
is a religion, Hindutva is a political ideology. In fact, it subsumes religion. Savarkar actually said Hindutva is much more than Hinduism. He was not himself a very religious man. You should read some of the stuff he's written sarcastically about the cow and so on. So he didn't want to be confined to the Hindu religion as he understood it. He said it's a political doctrine. Frankly, it was written in the 20s when very similar ideals and ideas were being developed and expressed in many European countries. Ideas of ethnic pride, of race purity, of the assertion of the dominance of the Aryans in Germany, and there was demonizing Jews, and India became demonizing Muslims. But the idea was very much this very old-fashioned ethno-nationalist identity, where pride was associated with an attribute of birth rather than of the kind of person you were or are. So that idea has been discredited everywhere in the world. It's gone. I mean, in Europe, there is practically nobody who will admit to being a believer in these kinds of things. Except that today, a small revival is happening in America and a big revival has happened in India of an ideology discredited by the 1940s, which had its heyday in those 20 years. So to my mind, Hinduism, and that's why I've written a couple of books trying to describe the religion, is actually very different from Hindutva. In fact, I consider the Hindutva ideology to be anti-Hindu, because what Hinduism preaches, the idea, I mean, you should read Swami Vivekananda, and for those of you who are more comfortable in English, he's the one major authority on Hinduism who actually preached and wrote and spoke in English, so you're reading the original. You don't have to worry about whether the translations from Sanskrit are off or not. And he basically said, you know, like many rivers flow, some straight, some crooked, down different mountains to the same sea. So also all ways of reaching out to God are the same. They reach the same divine presence. That idea, or the idea that Hinduism, as he put it, teaches the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. We accept all ways of worship as true. We accept all religions as true. So we are saying, for example, to our Muslim brothers, you believe you have the truth, I believe I have the truth. I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And that's the best basis for coexistence in a country like that. So that's the Hindu way, and what you've got instead is the Hindutva way, which is like the chauvinism of the British football hooligan. You know, my team is the only team to support, and if you're supporting the other team, I'll bash you on the head with my placard. That kind of thing is not Hinduism. Books I still need to write, including books that a lot of my recent writing has been impelled by a certain moral urgency about the trends in our country, and that hasn't fully played itself out. The Tharurosaurus is just a side distraction, but there are some serious books I want to write. But after that, I definitely would like to go back to fiction, because, you know, I was just joking in another session that there's a commercial from the 1980s for a well-known brand of beer that says it was the beer that reaches parts that other beers don't reach. And the truth about fiction is fiction reaches parts that non-fiction doesn't reach. Non-fiction reaches your mind, gives you a fact, a detail, a description, an argument. Fiction touches you in your heart, touches you in feelings and emotions, touches your soul. So one needs to get to that place. I've advocated now in writing for more than 25 years that we should switch to a system of directly elected executives. I think a lot of what we blame democracy for, we should actually blame inefficiency for. I mean, even a non-democracy like China, for example, gives a town mayor so much authority that a business person can say, I want to make this product in your town. That guy has a right to say yes, grant him the license, grant him the land, grant him the electricity connection, the water connection, the sewage connection, the access to his port or railway station or whatever outlet he has, and even the labor. That's China, it's a communist country. But that means that it's very easy for a businessman to come and do that in China, whereas in India, the mayor is nothing but the glorified chairman of a municipal corporation. All of his members are equally powerless. Then every decision will have to be made by committees of various people, and the purse strings will finally be controlled by an unelected bureaucrat the municipal commissioner. Now that kind of thing is pure inefficient. We have organized our system in such a way that there are multiple opportunities for people to be corrupt, and there's no locus of responsibility or authority to deliver results. So I introduced a bill in Parliament that would call for direct election of town mayors and village panchayat heads. And the idea would be you give them a fixed term. They are not dependent on a legislative majority. Because as you know, in our system, if you lose your majority over something you're out of office, that would no longer be the case. You'd have a real budget, which many of these mayors don't have at the moment. And you'd have the authority to spend it, and then be accountable to the voters yourself. So that seems to me a better way of ensuring results. Because that person knows ultimately that he can't blame anyone else or the system, or that responsibility and blame is not so diffused in the end that, that nothing gets done and everyone lives with it, which is what's going on too much in our country.
Thank you very much. There's a lady 3/4 of the way down near the middle aisle.
So let me not write it just yet. I know in some ways, I once joked, so I may as well repeat it, that I would probably have to call it the man with two horoscopes. Because I was born in London, and a horoscope was promptly made, and the information about my birth was sent to the home village where the family pundit cast a horoscope, and the two don't match in the slightest particular. So maybe it was a time difference or whatever that happened. But the result was, when I was getting married for the first time and my wife's family wanted horoscope, and the first one we gave, here's another one. If this works, you can have this one instead. So in many ways, my life has been a story of two narratives, the pursuit of two destinies at the same time. One was, my work in international affairs and in public life, in the UN first, then in politics, all of that. The other has been my life as a writer, somebody who reacts to the world he sees around him through words and ideas. And in some ways, in India today, the two have come close together, and one might say they each undermine and each overlap and each reinforce the other. So it's a peculiar situation. That could well be perhaps one theme of such a book. But as I said earlier, I'm in no hurry to write one. Give me time to live a little more before I write about living.
Okay, there's a gentleman near the...
Lord Wavell, who was the second last Viceroy of India, wrote in his diary, which I have read, that Rajaji, or Rajagopalachari as he called him, was more Tory than the staunchest British Conservative. And that expression, a Tory is somebody who's very right of centre on many aspects, economics, social, and so on. Rajaji was a man of great integrity. I'm an admirer of his. I was a strong supporter of the Swatantra Party in my college days, which he founded. So don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing Rajagopalachari, but he was writing from a particular political perspective. The sad truth is, unfortunately, no particular party has a monopoly on corruption in this country. And I'm afraid we could tell you a few stories about the party you admire and the money they've made.
Thank you. A young man right at the front here with glasses. If you could pass the mic to him. Thank you. Please keep it short, sir.
Sir, you said that...
Issues of debate, there is a party position. And if you disagree with the party position, your choices are invidious. You either disagree, in which case you fall out with your party and perhaps damage the party you believe is the best vehicle for larger issues in life, or you shut up, in which case indeed your free speech has been restricted. So there are restraints on serving politicians in public life which would not affect public intellectuals who are just doing their own thing. But there are always other sanctions too. A public intellectual who repeatedly criticizes this government is quite likely to face other kinds of retribution in today's India. That is sadly the climate we're in. I'll leave it there because I think there's time for one more question if you'll allow.
This young lady right at the front.
See, I mean, the good thing about me is you can always catch me out because I have a very long paper trail. I've been published in this country since my school days. I have magazines, articles, and books. So you know that what I'm saying can be checked against my own words. I was a critic of the emergency. I thought it was a bad idea. And I really disliked the Congress Party for doing it. And I've been a critic of the Congress Party on numerous occasions, including the emergency and the 84 Sikh riots and so on, where I felt the party could have done better. However, as I said when I fought my first election in 2009, And people pointed to my writings. I said, I'm fighting the election of 2009, not the election of 1977. Now, coming back to your specific concern about the 42nd Amendment, as you know, the critics of the emergency won the next election. And they had an opportunity to undo most of the things in the 42nd Amendment that they didn't like. The fact that they still left some things in there shows that there was a consensus on some of the ideas she put into the 42nd Amendment, but there wasn't a consensus on others, and those got struck down. So the good thing about democracy within our ground rules is that it...
Thanks also go to Michael Dwyer for facilitating the session and to Outlook for presenting the session. And Shashi Tharoor will be signing books, so you can purchase his book.